Maybe it's the gargoyles or the buzzard perched atop this tower.
Was built in the early 1900s to help.
There is a huge Gothic structure on top of a hill about 20 minutes outside of Louisville, Kentucky. For decades, it was a vital hospital in the fight against the massive tuberculosis epidemic. As a result, the facility saw thousands of deaths. Since the institution's closure, several parties have attempted to repurpose the building, but none have succeeded, and it is now regarded as one of the most haunted buildings in America. Let's take a deeper look into all of this, see if it's as haunted as everyone seems to think it is, and find out what the future may hold for this historic sanatory. It just so happens that in the previous year, 1882, the tuberculosis disease was formally discovered, and the land on which Waverly Hills would be built upon would be purchased. It was acquired by a man named Major Thomas H. Hayes, and he bought it to build a home for his family. But their new home atop these rolling hills was far from any local schools which his children could attend. So they built a single-room schoolhouse, and later named it Waverly Hill, after the teacher's fondness of the Waverly novels. But then, that newly understood tuberculosis was spreading around the country. I say newly understood, but really this infectious bacterial disease had few effective treatments at the time. It had terrifyingly high mortality rates, and it was spreading particularly fast in the state of Kentucky. Pulmonary tuberculosis, which mainly affects the respiratory system, seemed like a death sentence for those who contracted it. During this time, sanatoria began popping up all across the United States and Canada. In Louisville, the number of cases was particularly bad, and the city funded the construction of a new medical institution on the land they had just purchased from Major Thomas. So in 1910, the Waverly Hills Sanatorium opened up as a relatively small two-story clinic structure, as well as a few single-story pavilions which could house the patients. The number of cases in the area quickly exceeded the capacity they could handle, which at the time was only around 170 beds. The state then began working on a much larger and more permanent facility to house all of its patients. In 1926, a much larger four-story brick and stone structure opened, boosting the capacity to 400 beds, with the exterior adorned with Gothic architecture. It crucially added space, though, around 180,000 feet of it, and it was completed within 2 years at the cost of $1.1 million, which would be around $19 million today. Waverly Hills Sanatorium was considered state-of-the-art at the time. A cure for tuberculosis was non-existent at that point, and institutions like this were set up to accommodate treatments that were known to benefit patients. For example, the structure was set up with corridors known as sun porches. The patient rooms would line these hallways with exterior windows fitted with screens. Patient beds would be brought out onto the sun porches to soak up the fresh air and sunlight. At that point, that was the leading treatment for tuberculosis. Patients would spend as much time in the outdoors as possible, sometimes even sleeping out there, allowing their lungs to fill with the dense outdoor air. An overall positive spirit was also seen as a form of treatment. And Waverly Hills featured a library, a movie theater, a sprawling outdoor space, and for children, a rooftop playground. It all had to be self-contained, though, as TB patients had to be quarantined. But this was often not enough to save the lives of thousands of patients, many of whom were sent to Waverly Hills in the later stages of tuberculosis disease. Doctors would experiment with new treatments here. And while some patients claimed the institution was an inviting place, others would claim it was a lonely nightmare. Conditions were particularly bad for African American patients, whose segregated living situation was far less advanced than the primary structure. Thankfully, though, by the early 1950s, drugs were being developed that successfully cured patients who suffered from the disease, and the already falling mortality rate was supercharged by this breakthrough. After hundreds of years of suffering, tuberculosis was being eradicated across the country, which really left Waverly Hills Sanatorium as an unnecessary institution. By 1961, the state agreed that new patients had dried up, and the facility was shuttered for good. It instead reopened in 1962 as the Woodhaven Geriatric Center, a nursing home for elderly patients with advanced psychological and mobility impairments. But through the next few decades, the structure began to fall into disrepair and grew a reputation as a sometimes brutal and cruel place. The operation appeared to be in shambles, with patients being confined to their rooms for long periods of time, and even worse, tied to their chairs. The facility was losing money, so by 1980, the state took action to permanently close the building. In 1983, the majority of the land was auctioned off. A local businessman named J. Clifford Todd bought the land for just over $300,000, intending to convert it into a 500-room prison. As you already might expect, the locals weren't happy about this idea and strongly opposed the conversion. Local government officials agreed to scrap the plan, and by 1984, the land was divided into 3 parcels. 2 years later, Dr. Charles B. Sever purchased the parcel of land with the primary structure on it for just $128,000. That low price was justified, though, as the building had now been sitting abandoned for a few years unguarded. Vandals and scrappers broke in and began tearing at the copper piping. The structure was listed in the National Register of Historic Buildings, but really the doctor didn't have any plans and claimed he bought it just because he thought he got a good deal. So with nothing on the books, Waverly Hills continued to sit, abandoned and without a future. That was until March of 1996, when yet another new owner came in and purchased the site. Though, whatever you think his plans were going to be, you're absolutely wrong. The new owner, Robert Albert Husky, his plan was to construct a 155 feet tall Jesus statue on the Waverly Hill site. He said that after visiting Rio de Janeiro, he was inspired by their iconic statue of Christ. So he wanted to build an even taller one in Louisville, making it the tallest Jesus statue in the world. And he was dead serious, with a whole plan made up along with a conceptual model. The total cost for the statue would rise to $3 million, with another $10 million for a whole complex of shops and a church. The old sanatorium would be turned into condos and with donations opened up to the public. Albert Husky ended up only raising $3,000, so obviously, as you might expect, the project was canceled. The property would continue to sit abandoned for the next few years, seeing little changes, apart from a few outer buildings being demolished. The primary sanatorium would proceed to rot away, surprisingly with little documentation of the state. Ultimately, the property would be sold one last time to Tina and Charlie Mattingly. It was 2001, and the couple had hoped to open it up to the public for tours of the property. The family purchased it for $225,000. It seemed like they genuinely wanted to preserve the history and restore the structure back to its former glory. But the cost to do that would be monumental. The estimate from the Matting stating that a full renovation would be in the ballpark of around $50 million. But Waverly Hills was getting some attention. It was showcased to a national audience when it was featured in a 2001 episode of Scariest Places on Earth. It's definitely television of the early 2000s, but it perpetuated the long-standing ghost stories that had circulated locally in Louisville. In 2003, the Mattingleys began hosting tours and a seasonal haunted house at Waverly Hills Sanatorium to raise funds for restoration. They continued down this path for a couple of years with the historical foundation they had established, cleaning up the immediate grounds, installing new windows, and implementing safety systems to meet local codes. By this point, the building had transformed into one of America's most haunted locations. The original concept called for maintaining the first level as it was while transforming the second, third, and fourth stories into a bed and breakfast. A rooftop restaurant would be housed on the fifth story. With ambitious plans and limited funds, the restoration of Waverly Hills was a slow process. The building was cleaned up for seasonal events and regular tours, and the graffiti was mostly removed. The public was eager to visit the former sanatorium, which had been featured on several ghost hunting shows. Many believed that Waverly Hills was the most haunted place in America, which made sense given the abundance of urban legends and ghost stories surrounding the area. Some of the most well-known include the specter of a little boy named Timmy, who tragically fell from the roof. This tragic event likely occurred because, for some reason, the children's playground was placed on the roof. According to legend, if you throw a ball into the area, it will be returned to you. Another tragic story involves a nurse who allegedly committed suicide in room 502. Perhaps the most well-known story is about the hospital's concrete tunnel. The tunnel was originally built as a passageway for goods to move up and down the mountain more efficiently. But outsiders have claimed that the tunnel was supposedly built to hide the thousands of bodies of deceased patients from others. Similarly, the number of deaths on the property has been the subject of debate. Some say 6,000 people died here, while others put the figure as high as 60,000. The truth, however, is far more difficult to determine. During the early years, patient records were kept off-site in downtown Louisville, but during the 1937 flood, most of those records were destroyed. Even after the flood, administrative record-keeping was a bit shaky. So it's really impossible to determine how many people actually died at the facility, or how many were treated here. In general, experts and historians estimate a number closer to 6,000 to 10,000, which is still shocking and a testament to the deadly nature of the disease. As for the other legends, well, those are a little nothing I've seen in the videos has convinced me to change my mind. But I also haven't seen anything that proves anything. The Mattingly family and their non-profit organization have capitalized on the public fascination and have really turned Waverly Hills into its own brand with a new logo, a gift shop, and regular tours across this vast structure. In the last few years, the site has seen summer 4th of July events, car meets, and so much more, turning this once-abandoned hospital into a relatively thriving community event space. Now, there has been some criticism angled towards this new lease on life, as there is something to be said about how respectfully all of this has been presented since, again, this is a site of massive suffering and loss. In 2022, there was actually a contestment of power between the Mattingly and their nonprofits. The nonprofit alleged that the family misappropriated the Historical Society's funds for personal use. There were a lot of allegations being thrown around, and it got a bit messy with an entire lawsuit. But it all came to a head later in the year when both parties agreed to collaborate and drop the suit. The outcome for Waverly Hills has been notable to observe. Particularly noteworthy is the significant amount of history that has been archived, facilitated by the Historical Society, established by the Mattingly, as well as researchers from the Filson Historical Society. Good to mention is that we didn't produce this video to cover the whole paranormal side of things, but to preserve history. And it's great that Waverly Hills has been saved from a very unknown fate. For decades, the sanatorium faced drastic changes and concepts that would have totally reshaped its future. It's had a strange and unlikely journey to get where it is now. And while it is known as one of the most haunted places in the world where pain and death were prevalent for years, it was also a facility where the sick could find compassion and care. People came here with essentially a death sentence and were given everything doctors knew at the time to help them. Sometimes, the original purpose of Waverly Hills gets overlooked, which is why it's great that the building still stands today to preserve its history. If you want to help support our channel, then give this video a like. Also, subscribing is greatly appreciated, so you'll get notified of new, upcoming videos on our channel. Leave a comment below if you have any other ideas for abandoned topics that we should cover next.